Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Q2 results for the economy are out, and the key question is, how should they be interpreted? The government has gone on record to say that these are good results, but is that assessment justified? Joining me now to answer precisely those questions is the country director of the International Growth Centre, India's former chief statistician and one of the country's top economists, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, Q2 results show that GDP has grown by 6.3%, which is 7.6% more than the comparable period of 2019-2020, the last pre-pandemic year. Were you expecting this, or are you somewhat surprised by the outcome?
It's a little on the higher side. I had expected around 6%, but that would be splitting hairs, really, 6.36.
Now, I noticed that GDP has grown by 6.3%, but GVA has only grown by 5.6%, and therefore there's a fairly substantial difference between the two. What's your explanation for this? And secondly, what does it tell us about the state of the economy?
Well, Karan, the GVA is the true measure of what is happening to production. And 5.6 is fairly low. I think the expectations were higher than that. And that's something we can come back to. But the difference between the two is the total amount of indirect taxes collected by the government minus the subsidies that government pays out. Now, we do know that GST collections have gone up very strongly during this period, but it's not large enough to explain the discrepancy. So it suggests that government subsidies have gone down. Now, on that, we have no information. These are there in the government record somewhere. We don't know whether it's central subsidies or state subsidies, but that is something we need to keep our eye on, because in a weak economy, if you're actually lowering subsidies, then you may be doing damage to parts of the economy which need that help.
But the interesting thing is that if GVA is the true measure of what the economy is producing, and it's only 5.6, and the difference between GVA and GDP is because of indirect taxes, then actually GDP of 6.3 doesn't really reflect the production of the economy. GVA is a better one. But we've grown at 6.3 because of taxes, but actually we're producing at 5.6.
This is correct. So that's what's happening at the production side. The GDP is a measure of income. And the difference between the value of the production and the total income generated is what the government is expropriating.
Now, this is a very important thing, because I think a lot of laymen who don't understand the difference between GVA and GDP will now realize that actually, in terms of what the economy is producing, GVA is the more accurate figure, yes, and it's only 5.6. GDP is higher, but that's because of taxes.
Or worse, reduced subsidies.
Now, reduced subsidies would, of course, affect people who are dependent upon them.
This is right. And subsidies are fairly targeted. So the category of people who have lost out would be adversely affected.
And the people who are targeted and have lost out would be the poorest, who can least afford not to be subsidized.
I would imagine so.
Let me come to something else. 6.3% GDP growth in Q2 is the upper end of the RBI forecast for quarter 2. Does this suggest to you that in GDP terms, the economy is heading towards 7% growth at the end of the year, assuming we make 4.6% in the second half? Or are you concerned by the fact that on the very same day that Q2 results were released, core sector growth for October came out and it was only 0.1%, which I believe is the lowest for 20 months. And the second worrying factor is that the international global situation is not going to help India's growth story. If anything, it will retard our exports. So do you think that 7% figure is attainable?
With 6.3% in the second quarter, yes, it is. Had it been 6 or sub 6, then it would have been relatively difficult, because then you would need closer to 5% in the second half. But you're right. I mean, there are very strong headwinds. And the global situation is not going to help at all. I think that's fairly clear. And it's not just exports, Karan. Remember, what happens is when the rest of the world starts going into recession, the producers there look for alternate markets. And India looks like a very, very attractive alternate market. And so you're going to have all sorts of countries targeting India as an export destination. So there's going to be additional competition coming from imports, which could affect our production.
Now, there's a very interesting thing here. If you believe that 7% now looks attainable because the 6.3 figure in quarter 2, then you're also suggesting that the claim made by the chief economic advisor, and I think he made it the same day as the results came out, that the economy will grow between 6.8 and 7% is more or less correct.
It appears to be, yes, unless something very dramatic happens in the last quarter.
Let's at this point look at individual sectors of the economy, and the point you made a moment ago about imports and imports increasing, I'll bring up in a moment's time. But let's start with sectors of the economy that have done well. And I suppose the first one that comes to mind is agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's grown by 4.6%, and the Indian Express says this is the highest in 10 quarters. But many people are surprised because as recently as September the 21st, the Ministry of Agriculture said that the sowing of kharif seeds and crops, particularly food grains, oil and jute, was fairly substantially below last year. And we know on top of that we've had deficient rains in June and excess rains in September. So how do you view this 4.6 figure?
This is where the discrepancy, my expectation was about 6%. The 6.3 that we've got, a large chunk of it really comes from this. I had expected agriculture to be sub 3.
So it's grown by 1.6 above your expectation?
Above my expectation. And I was going precisely by the sort of information that you just talked about.
Could there be an inaccuracy in this 4.6?
Well, you see, this data is collected by the state governments and simply compiled. All right? The real question mark out here, crop agriculture is reasonably well calculated. What is a gray area are what are called the allied activities, which is primarily fisheries, animal husbandry, and so on.
Dairy,
yeah, animal husbandry. Those figures are a little less reliable.
So there is room here for this to be revised downwards?
It could be, but that's not going to happen in a while.
And therefore, there is a question mark both about the agricultural 4.6, and therefore, there's also a question mark about that 6.3, because that's very dependent on the 4.6.
Yes.
So it is possible that when we know more and we have a better idea of what's happened to fisheries, animal husbandry and dairy, that we may be revising not just agriculture but the total GDP figure of 6.3.
This is right. Well, not the GDP. What you would revise is the GVA figure.
GVA figure, quite right.
Right, and then of course the GDP
will come down
as a consequence.
Now, one reason why there is concern or doubt about that 4.6 figure is, as Roshan Kishore points out in the Hindustan Times, 4.6% growth in agriculture, he says, has not boosted the earnings for rural labourers. rural wages, he says, contracted for the 10th consecutive month in September 2022. So you have a sort of seemingly anomalous situation. Agriculture seems to be growing at quite a fast rate, and yet rural incomes are contracting quite steadily.
Yes, and the reason, Karan, is simply because if you remember, a very large number of people went back. There's a reverse migration that took place in 2020 and 2021. I don't think most of them have come back yet, which means that today, rural India continues to be seriously labor surplus. Right? So the competition for whatever agricultural work there is going to depress wages.
As a result of which, even if agricultural production is going up, the actual income that people are earning is going down because there are more people now dependent on that income.
No, it's the wage workers.
Yeah.
The farmers will be gaining.
But the wage workers will be earning less.
The wage workers are going to be suffering.
And in a sense, I suppose this is reflected by a story on the front page of today's Business Standard, which says that in fact, rural demand for FMCG goods has actually fallen pretty sharply between October and November. It's down, I think, if I recall correctly, almost by 18%.
Yes.
That's again a reflection of this.
Well, it is a reflection not just of that. Again, we need to realize that if you look at rural households, agriculture accounts for less than 40% of their incomes. About 60% comes from non-agricultural activities. My suspicion is that the non-agricultural activities have not revived yet either.
So, in a sense, there's a double whammy.
Well, it's not a double whammy. So, the farm families, the landowning families, they would be getting a boost from agriculture, but the non-agricultural income would continue to be subdued. So, the total increase in income is not going to be that large.
And as you said, wage labor on farms is also being paid less. So, for the wage labor, there's a double whammy.
For the wage labor, there's a double whammy.
Professor Sen, let's then come to a third sector of the economy that's doing well. And this time I'm talking about private consumption. It amounts to roughly 55-56% of GDP, and it's grown at 9.6%. But I noticed that India Ratings has pointed out that this is not a broad-based recovery because, as they say, the current consumer demand is skewed towards goods and services consumed largely by households falling in the upper income bracket. And if I've understood them correctly, this means that consumption for the rich and the well-off has certainly increased, but consumption for the poor may not have increased, it may be static, or it may even have diminished.
Yes, as we discussed, the rural India is still suffering. And a large chunk of what we classify as the lower income groups in India are in rural India. And they continue to face very weak economy. There is no question that the well-off have improved their conditions considerably. Corporate India has been going great guns, very strong performances coming across. And the people who are working in corporate India are doing very well as well. So there's no question about that. But, the kind of growth we are talking about, 9.5% growth in consumption, cannot be explained just by what's happening at the top. Because we are talking about maybe 25 to 30% of households. That can't explain this kind of growth. So there must be some trickle down that is going on. But how far it's trickling down, we don't know. But if you look at the FMCG data, and FMCG data is pretty sensitive to current lifestyles, very weak growth, particularly in rural India, which suggests that the trickle down hasn't gone very far down.
So
I would say it's the well-off and the middle class, which seems to be doing reasonably well.
And the poor are not.
Poor probably are not.
So now if you look at what we've just discussed in terms of consumption and the fact that this is not broad-based, the middle class and the rich are doing well, the poor are not. And if you add to that what we spoke a moment ago about rural India, where farmers may be doing well, but rural wage laborers are not, you get a sense in which inequality is increasing in terms at least of
Inequality
income.
is increasing for sure. I mean, I don't think there is any doubt about it. And it's been increasing for a while now. I mean, this is not new. It started increasing post-demonetization, where non-corporate India got badly hit and corporate India increased its market share. It began there and it's just getting worse and worse and worse.
And for a democratic country where the majority are poor, not rich, the increase in inequality is a worrying concern.
Yeah, well, it depends. I don't think we fully understand how their behavior works, because what it could do is give further boost to their aspirations and hope.
But that would be lovely, because that would then lead eventually to increased production.
Hopefully.
But it could also lead to despair, which is the other end of the equation.
Yes, that would be worse.
And again, none of this becomes immediately apparent when you look at the bald Q2 results. It's only when you analyze and dig deeper and you explain that this inequality begins to become apparent.
Yes.
And then you ask yourself, is it a matter of concern or not?
That's correct.
Now, a fourth area where it seems the economy is doing quite well is in terms of private investment. It's grown by 10.4%. And in this case, the Indian Express says, and I'm quoting, this is the best growth over any 3-year period going back to financial year 14. So in terms of specifically talking about private investment, would you say the finance minister and even the chief economic advisor are correct when they say private investment is picking up?
Private investment is certainly picking up, right? But number one, there's a base effect. Investment last year wasn't doing anything. Now it's starting to pick up. So there's a very strong base effect playing out. So growth started last year, but investments didn't pick up. So investments are now growing with a lag. So that's number one. The second thing is, if the story that we've been telling up to now sort of hangs together, then the investment is happening primarily in corporate India. And that is borne out by banking data. The problem there is that corporate India tends to be far more capital intensive than non-corporate India.
So it's not creating commensurate jobs.
It will not create commensurate jobs, and it won't even create commensurate output, right? Because you are not, the amount of output you'd get per unit of capital is less in corporate India. So in terms of how much production capacity is being built, it's probably lower than if the pattern that we had seen earlier, which was a rough balance between corporate and non-corporate India, had been maintained. So, one would have to watch this a little carefully.
So once again, prima facie, when you see on paper investment has gone up by 10.4%, it's a little misleading, because as you pointed out, jobs may not grow up the same way and production may not go up the same way. And it's happening in corporate India, not the informal sector.
Yes, but there's some good news on this front. Again, the RBI data, it's not going to come from the GDP data, but the RBI data suggests that after a lull of more than 2 years, or 2.5 years actually, term lending to non-corporates has started to rise, and rise reasonably strongly. Now, we should just hope, and this is recent, this is only the last 2-3 months. Let's hope the trend continues, because there lies our hope.
That is the hope, that the informal sector, MSMEs, will start benefiting from fresh investment.
That's right.
But at the moment, as you say, this is only 2-3 months data, and it's therefore, I presume, a fledgling hope. It hasn't nurtured.
At the moment, it hasn't fully matured, yes.
Let's now come to sectors that have actually disappointed in the Q2 results. And clearly the most obvious is manufacturing, which has shrunk by 4.3%. And it's a much greater shrinking than people had expected. What would be the explanation for this?
Well, the first, most obvious explanation. I mean, if you juxtapose this number against the strong consumer growth that you've just talked about. So you have consumer consumption growing at 9.3%, and you have manufacturing falling by 4%. Now, that's a very unusual movement. Now, one of the things that certainly explains it is that our exports have collapsed over this period. The second is, if the story that we are talking about is correct, and it's the upper and the middle income groups who have benefited, their consumption pattern is much more import dependent than it is dependent upon domestic production.
And imports have gone up by 89%.
And imports have gone through the roof. All right? So what's happening is incomes are going up, but that income is being used to essentially consume goods which have high import content or are directly being imported.
This is an instance where, if your analysis is correct, private consumption going up is not actually benefiting the Indian economy because we're buying more goods from abroad rather than goods made here.
That's right.
And
the foreigners are not buying our goods.
Quite right. So again, it's a sort of double whammy. Foreigners aren't buying our goods and we're buying foreign goods instead.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm quoting Roshan Kishore from the Hindustan Times. He says, whilst manufacturing has shrunk by 4.3%, manufacturing PMI for each of the 3 months of Q2 has been very significantly above 50%. Do we therefore have a sort of K-shaped situation in manufacturing where the formal sector, as reflected by PMIs, is doing pretty well, but the informal sector, which includes MSMEs, is pretty struggling?
Well, the PMI looks at only 400 companies. And these are 400 very large companies. We know they're doing well. All right? It's the rest which is not doing well.
That may be 90%.
Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the informal. It could be the smaller of the formal companies as well. I suspect there is a lot of that because when we do the GDP data, we have no data on the informal manufacturing sector. What we look at is the index of industrial production, they're all formal enterprises, but of varying sizes, going down to fairly small ones. And that's where the damage is coming. So it's really in the smaller of the organized sector. What's happening to the informal sector, we don't know, because we are extrapolating. We are assuming that the informal is doing roughly the same as the small formal firms.
I'll come to the informal sector in a moment's time, but let me pick up on something you've just said about the formal sector. PMIs reflect 400 companies, and they clearly suggest that these 400 are doing extremely well.
Yes.
But the smaller companies in the corporate sector, you suspect, are not doing that well. They're struggling. Yeah. And therefore, it is a K, but it's a very skewed K where the vast majority, the smaller corporate sector and presumably the informal sector, are all doing pretty badly, and it's only a small minority that are doing well.
Yes, and it's a story which would need to be nuanced because what happens is that in the Indian context, a very large chunk of our so-called formal manufacturing depends on ancillarization to SMEs. Now, those ancillaries will ride the coattails of the large. And the large cannot expand without the small expanding along with them. It's the ones which don't have that ancillary relationship
are in trouble.
Which are the ones which will be in trouble.
Let's then come directly to MSMEs, because they represent, I believe, something like 30% of the economy, perhaps as much as 45% of employment. But it's a sort of black hole about which we don't know very much. What's your sense about what's happening to the informal sector and MSMEs in particular?
Well, as you said, we don't know very much. There is a survey which has been done. We are awaiting the results of that. But what we will not know, as of now, I don't know whether we'll ever know it, is what has happened to the overall number of MSMEs that exist. Because if, as I suspect, there have been deaths, then...
Did you say debt or death?
Death.
Death.
Of companies. Those are not going to get revived, not under the current circumstances.
And quite a few may have died.
And quite a few may have, we don't know how much. For that, we'll have to wait for the economic census to happen. And that, again, for the same reason that The population census hasn't happened. That's also held up. But until that information comes in, we really don't know how much permanent damage has taken place.
So it's possible, theoretically, that a very large number of MSMEs have died and we just don't know.
We just don't know.
And therefore, as a result of those large numbers having died, a lot of people could be unemployed or underemployed,
Yes.
which is why their demand has fallen and which is why their consumption won't be reflected in that 9.6 figure.
This is correct.
So actually, we could have a very dire situation, MSMEs, we just don't know.
Yes. As of now, we don't know. We only guess, we suspect.
And your suspicion is that it's a bad situation.
Yes, I do.
Let's come to another area where the results seem to be disappointing. I'm talking about government consumption. It's contracted by 4.4%, but perhaps more importantly, I believe it's now 20% below pre-pandemic levels. Now, at a time when the economy needs boosting, this is clearly counterintuitive. So who's to blame? State governments, central government, or both?
Well, let's first get into it. Karan, one of the things we've been talking about all the time is the desirability of moving government expenditures away from consumption to investment. That has happened. Government investments have gone up sharply. It's government consumption coming down. Now, the question that arises is, what are the kinds of things that the government has stopped buying? A lot depends on that. On that, we have no information. We just know what the total is. The total has shrunk.
What would it worry you if they'd stop buying?
Well, most of the stuff won't worry me very much. But what comes as a part of government consumption are what are called transfers. All right? Income transfers, for instance. That's a part of government consumption. And if those are going down, that's not good news, again, because those are targeted to the poor.
There are even some reports in the papers that the transfer of money to farmers, which began in 2019, is now lagging behind.
Quite sharply.
And in many instances, it hasn't happened.
Yes.
This would be one explanation why rural demand is falling, because they're not getting the money they were supposed to get.
This is true. And that's one of the reasons why government consumption could be falling.
And if this is the explanation, then it is clearly counterintuitive, because that money, if it was paid, would boost demand, which economy needs.
Yeah.
But by not paying it, you're retarding demand.
Yes. Now, this would require us to actually do a fairly detailed analysis of the budgetary numbers. This we're not going to get from the GDP numbers. GDP can only point us
in that direction.
But this requires an analysis of the government. And this, when I say government, I'm talking center plus states, the collective.
So we won't have a clearer answer until Mrs. Sitaraman presents the budget,
That's
I
right.
think on the 1st of February.
Yeah.
So we'll remain in a question mark area, wondering,
Well, no,
how worrying
a
is
certain
this?
amount of information is available in terms of the government does put out some information on its fiscal position.
But the one thing we agree on is that the money that's to be paid to farmers has clearly not been paid on time. It's lagging behind in several instances. Newspapers have covered it in fairly extensive detail. And that is clearly not good when the economy needs a boost.
Well, yeah, and this is not new, by the way, Karan. I mean, governments for a while now have gotten into the habit of delaying release of payments, right? And in government accounts, a payment not made is equivalent to a consumption not made. So you could have actually bought stuff and never just not paid for it. Until that payment is made, it's not going to appear on the government account.
Quite
and
right.
It won't get picked up by GDP.
And therefore, the position, once again,
That's
is
right.
a bit deceptive and misleading for the rest of us.
That is right.
A third area where the quarter two results are worrying, and we've talked about it briefly, is imports. They've gone up by an astonishing 89% at a time when our exports are facing headwinds and actually exports are diminishing. They're not growing. Could we end up with a current account deficit problem? And do you fear that the CAD could cross 3%?
That's very much on the cards.
Over 3%?
Yeah, that's very much on the cards.
How worrying would that be?
At the moment, not particularly worrying because, this, so long as this is not a long-term trend, we are witnessing very, very volatile global economic situation. And during the course of this volatility, these sort of things will happen and can happen. I won't lose sleep over it. But the trends we are seeing and what little we are seeing suggests that one, India's consumption pattern is becoming more and more import intensive. So reduction in the rate of growth of imports is unlikely to happen unless there's a dramatic change in our income distribution in the future. On the other hand, the rest of the world is going to go into a recession. Things are going to become a little worse.
So exports won't grow.
So exports are not going to grow.
In fact, they're shrinking.
That's right. But at some point, the rest of the world will turn around. Hopefully.
But you're suggesting that CAD above 3%, we don't know quite how much above, but above 3% is likely to be the situation for at least a year or two until
quite possible,
until recession in the West
that's right,
reverses and our import demand diminishes.
That's right.
So we've got a year or two of a fairly high CAD above 3%.
That's correct. But I think the financial flows are strong enough for us to be able to weather that.
The reserves in particular.
Yeah.
They've gone up this week to 550 billion.
That's right.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but let's look down the road for a moment. If high interest rates in the West continue, and it seems as if they could, if commodity prices remain elevated, including oil, and again, that seems as if that could be the case, oil dances around 87, 88 for Brent. If the recession in the West is beginning and we don't know when it'll end, and we have no idea what's going to happen to the war in Ukraine, it could end, but it could continue. In those situations, I imagine that India is not going to get a lot of economic support from the global situation. Therefore, the growth story in 2023 and 2024 is, I presume, critically dependent upon domestic demand and domestic consumption.
This is correct. I mean, we should not expect any help from the global economy. If anything, we as a country may help the rest of the world, which is good for our egos, if nothing else. But yes, we will have to depend upon domestic consumption. Now, if the pattern of domestic consumption that we have witnessed, if this income distribution trend continues, our domestic demand growth is not going to be that high. Right? We do need to correct this distortion because it's really the real increase in domestic demand comes from the poorer classes. And getting more income out to them, I think, is important.
That's one point. The other is if domestic demand does continue in the pattern in which it is, your demand for imports is going to keep increasing, and that's a worrying factor.
Yes. Yes.
So you want domestic demand to increase, but you want it to increase amongst the poor rather than that much more amongst
the lower middle class and the poor, yeah.
And that's where income support becomes essential.
Well, income support is a palliative. It's not a solution.
But we may need it for a year or two.
We may need it for a year or two, given what's happening in the rest of the world. But the focus should be reviving the SMEs as quickly as possible.
Let's come to that by talking about unemployment and by the falling labor force participation rate. Because if domestic demand is important to keep growth going in 23-24, then unemployment is a worrying factor, and certainly falling labor force participation is a worrying factor. Now, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that in November, unemployment was 8%, the highest in the last 3 months. And I know that for the first few or maybe many more months of this financial year, the demand for NREGA has been substantially greater than it was in the last pre-pandemic year. And I take it that means two things. A, people don't have jobs. But more importantly, perhaps, because they don't have jobs, they're not creating the demand the economy needs. So if we're dependent upon domestic demand for 23-24, unemployment and falling labor force participation is working against our interests.
No, the falling labor force participation rate is a huge worry. Our labor force participation rate is embarrassingly low. We're one of the lowest in the world. And it's something we need to think about. Well, what is going on out here? Why are people dropping out of the labor force? Although the CMIE number is a little worse, the government's labor force survey gives a little higher number than that, but it's still very, very low. But that's a long-term fix. I mean, that's not something you're going to fix immediately. Now, as far as unemployment is concerned, everybody agrees it's somewhere in the 7 to 9% range. Now, unfortunately, we've been conditioned to think that our base unemployment level should be about 6%. That's not true. Historically, until 2016, our unemployment rate used to be about 3%. So 3 to 8%, that's 5% of the labor force.
And it's happened in the last 6 years.
6 years is not a small number. It's a huge number. It's that 3.5% unemployment rate that we should be targeting. And that's in the short to medium run. Labor force participation is going to take time because there are, I think, behavioral issues involved there. But that should be worked on as well, because otherwise we will not be able to fully utilize our growth potential.
But you're saying something again that I think is very important. During the Modi years 2016 to 2022, the economy may have been growing somewhere between 6 and 7% a year. But during that period, unemployment has also grown by a sizable 5 or 6%.
Yes.
Which means that the economic growth has benefited the rich who have jobs, but the poor have been losing jobs, which is why demand is the problem.
That is a part of the issue.
And this also means that we're becoming a more unequal nation.
Yes, which is why you're seeing weakness in wages, not just rural wages, even urban unskilled labor. The wage rates are not going up strongly enough.
I take it this is what people call jobless growth. The economy is growing at 6, 7%,
Yes.
Jobs are diminishing.
Yes.
With all of that in the background, let me put my last question to you. Some agencies, like Nomura and UNCTAD, are actually forecasting that India's growth in 23-24 will be just 4.7% in the case of Nomura, 4.8% in the case of UNCTAD. The government strenuously refutes this. But could it end up as bad as this?
Let's look at the government's own figures. They're talking about a 7% growth in the current year. What that means, given the numbers we've seen, means that in the last half of this year, the economy, by government figures, would be growing at 4.5%. All Nomura and
He's extrapolating
is extrapolating that. Why does that surprise you? Because in this last half, we don't have the base effects of the first half of the year, where last year things were depressed. We are over that hump.
So
all they're doing is extrapolating, and I don't see any reason why the government should get particularly agitated about it.
So if I hear you correctly, you're saying 4.7, 4.8 may well be what we manage in 23-24.
Yes, unless measures are taken. All of these are conditional. The economy does react to policy. The economy does react to budgetary stimulus. The question is, what does the government plan to do, which we will find out in February.
So the interesting thing is this. Unless measures are taken, we could actually end up in 23-24 with just 4.7, 4.8%.
That's right.
Very quickly, what are the measures you think the finance minister should announce in the budget? One, I take it, is income support for the poor to make sure their demand goes up.
No, I mean, as I said, that is a palliative. That's a short-term fix for the demand problem. That's not a solution. It can't be done continuously. You really need to focus on how do we get the SMEs back. And the problem that you're going to have there is that the corporates have already captured a large chunk of that market, and they're not going to give it up without a fight. So it's going to be an uphill struggle. And it's something that the government has to think through, because the government does have very limited instruments that it can use.
We know now from our answer that the key thing is to revive MSMEs and get them back their market share. But what should she do to make that happen? Is it money and credit, or is it something more?
No. Credit, what we are talking about is people actually starting new enterprises or expanding their existing enterprises, which requires essentially term loans, not working capital. Working capital comes after you start production. At the moment, term loans are not guaranteed. The government has given guarantees for working capital loans, but not for term loans. And that is something that the government may want to look at quite seriously.
Is this a sort of mudra scheme?
It is mudra scheme, but the mudra scheme is not a guaranteed scheme.
This now needs to be guaranteed.
It may well need it, I don't know.
So term loans possibly guaranteed by the government.
Term loans are critical.
And possibly guaranteed by the government.
Yeah.
And how do we make sure that the MSMEs actually avail of them?
That you cannot. The only hope we have is that as a country, we have displayed very high levels of entrepreneurship. And let's hope that sense of entrepreneurship continues to be there among the youth of today.
So side by side with term loans, which are possibly guaranteed, you're also relying on the sense of entrepreneurship of the Indian young.
Yeah.
In other words, their determination and ambition to improve their lives is really what we're counting on.
Yes.
We can help them with term loans, but if that ambition and determination has somehow disappeared, we're in serious trouble.
Then we're in serious trouble, yes. Then we have to rethink everything from bottom up.
And that is a terrible situation for any country to be in.
This is true.
Because you don't know where you start.
Well, yeah, in a sense, one has to revisit all the beliefs we had about our economy. And one of the beliefs we had is a vibrant entrepreneurial culture.
So at the end of the day, the future of the Indian economy hinges critically on Indian young people retaining their entrepreneurial spirit and the ambition to push it ahead.
That's right.
We don't know if it exists. We have no reason to believe it doesn't either, but it needs to manifest itself.
Yes.
And
we need to help that along.
And we need to help that along. And that's the key task for the finance minister in her budget.
I think so.
When that budget is presented, we must get back together, and I very much want to hear whether the finance minister has done what clearly she needs to do. Thank you very much for this interview. It's a gloomy, depressing note we end on, but I imagine it is also the truth and reality. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.